Hey, it's me, Beanie. Today we mourn the death of my hard drive. It served me for many years and stored many things, and then died when I had like 5 minutes left to edit the Ultra Kill video. It would have been cool if it just waited a sec, but you know, anyway, I've downloaded all my 3D programs back and shit, so I've got a vote here, and it looks like it's time to call a winner. We've got the look at that, another robot. Just did one of these before, so you know, no biggie. Oh, hey, whoa, whoa. Ah! The old bird. Also referred to in the files as the RadMech. It's one of the newer entities introduced in Lethal Company's version 50. So welcome all and welcome back. This thing carries a massive presence, standing at a towering 19 feet tall and 11 feet wide according to its in-game data entry. Effectively acting as a walking tank and commonly referred to as a mech both in said files and colloquially, despite its apparent lack of any entry points or any visible means of piloting it. The old bird is a war machine of its time, wielding all sorts of offensive capabilities, from its grabby claw arm akin to an arcade machine to a barreled arm that doubles as a flamethrower and a rocket launcher. Mechanically, I can't explain how that works, I'm not an engineer, but I'm sure they figured it out, it's all sci-fi. It can also fly, courtesy of thrusters for feet. Although the in-game lore suggests that these weren't for extended flights, but instead for landing on a planet from orbit. On the chest, what I initially chalked up to being a radiator for cooling was actually a large speaker for sonic warfare, accompanied by 2 smaller speakers on the shoulders. I couldn't find any evidence of the chest-mounted sound cannon actually being used in the game, but maybe in future we'll see it in action. Delving into the actual individual components of the old bird, it's no secret that it's fairly simple in shape. Most of its parts can be boiled down to their primitive shapes fairly easily, with most of the major shapes being fairly cubic. Given this is a hard surface model, meaning there isn't much organic reference to pull from, most if not all of my reference consists of straight up comparing against the original model and giving it a good polish in its shapes and design, with the occasional look at some industrial machinery for guidance. For that reason, this will be a fairly solid look into the more technical aspects of the process. Now that we've gone past the formalities, let's start taking a practical look into rebuilding the old bird. Beginning with the torso. Using something called a modifier, we can apply all sorts of effects to our geometry. In this case, we're going to apply a mirror modifier, which will symmetrize our geometry so we don't have to waste time working on both sides. The torso of our mech has a sort of trapezoid shape, not quite perfectly rectangular, but more so wider at its midsection. Thus, we'll have to add loop cuts, an enclosed circle of edges that give us a more editable geometry to work with on our model, and allow us to achieve the shape we're looking for. The 2 shoulder-mounted speakers are actually quite cubic as well, and it's at this point that I should give you a heads up that I'm effectively going to rebuild the original model before I stop spicing it up. Meaning for this first phase of the project, it'll be fairly indistinguishable from the original. In a way, this could serve as a speculative look into how Zekas, the main developer of Lethal Company, probably put this thing together. But with that aside, we'll keep going. The speakers are made up of cubes with smaller rounded cubes tucked inside, and the head is a cube, with the bottom edges beveled to make it round, and the front lenses are made up of cylinders, along with 2 holes above it that almost look like a stand-in for eyes, but I'm actually not that sure. And if you're starting to see a pattern here, it's because most of this initial blocking out phase is exactly that. We're blocking out the shapes using primitives, so we can get an idea of how our model exists in the 3D space. So, to give a brief rundown on some of what you're seeing, 3D geometry is made up of faces, which in turn are made up of corner points called vertices. The more faces that exist on the geometry, also known as the mesh, the more area you'll be able to modify. Obviously, the higher the number of faces, the higher the processing power, so you need to be careful with managing your polygon budget. Polygons being a plane with at least 3 straight sides or angles, typically 4 in this scenario, i.e. the faces we are editing here. Extrusion is the process of creating more geometry by pulling out or in from existing faces, which can then be further altered and built upon. Hopefully that gives a brief enough understanding to see what I'm doing in this initial phase, editing a series of cubes, spheres, and cylinders to achieve the results I want. There's also beveling, something you can see being used here on the upper arms of the robot. It's just rounding up an edge. The shortcut is Ctrl-B if you're interested, but I only use it sparingly since it can kind of mess with some of the geometry and stuff. Further down the forearms, our mech has these little connector joints that seem to be our elbows and rotate the forearms. Although from a mechanical standpoint these don't actually have any space to rotate, and that's fine since it's not the part we pay attention to when this thing reveals itself. That being said, I would like to have some more plausibility in our design, so while I leave it as is for the moment, it's something we'll come back to and address later once we're done blocking everything out. The right arm of our mech bears our flamethrower bazooka hybrid, and for now we're going to settle with a cylinder-based barrel to fit as a placeholder and move on to the left arm where we'll find our grabber. This is basically the same to start, fitting a cylinder inside our elbow socket, except this time, we're putting indents on the bottom where the fingers can fit, which in this case are flat plane faces that are extruded down to make a kind of slightly curved talon. Now we can't have it just be a two-dimensional shape, and you could easily just extrude the whole shape down to give it some thickness, but I like my non-destructive workflows. So I'm going to use a solidify modifier. This is just a modifier that, when applied to a flat mesh, will give it that thickness it needs, along with options for how much thickness, as well as other fine-tuning options. With essentially the entire upper body given a basic blockout, we can move a bit lower down the body to the legs. And while most of the shape language on the old bird is fairly blocky, with some exception of cylindrical shapes around the hands and head, the thighs of this robot are actually quite rounded off. So it's time to get our cube, slap a mirror modifier on it, and round this one off with subdivision. Subdivision is a process where a piece of geometry has its faces divided into smaller ones, exponentially increasing the amount of geometry there is to work with. And we're just doing this using a subdivision modifier. This process generally also includes some smoothing, giving simpler shapes, like our cube, a more spherical look. And while it's possible to do subdivision as a hard mesh edit, it's much more useful to do this through modifiers, since it'll still affect our subject, but we'll still be able to edit it as if it were in its original blocky form, allowing for much more maneuverability when making edits to this kind of mesh. It's here that we can use something called edge creasing, and it's part of the reason we use modifiers to subdivide our mesh. Selecting the edges around the cuts, we can apply edge creasing to diminish the smoothing effect applied by our subdivision modifier. That way, we can achieve a harsher edge without sacrificing any of the shapes around it. Pop quiz! What did the solidify modifier do? I hope you remembered, because we're using it again on these flat faces to create the small connecting pivot that joins the thighs to what I'm gonna say is the mech's knees. Our thruster feet are cylinders, and it's simple enough to extrude it into the shape we want. And speaking of cylinders, we can create a new one with a much smaller amount of faces, to the point that it looks something like a hexagonal bolt, like the ones we see adorning the surface of the mech, adding an indent in the center of these for good measure. We can just scatter these over the mech as per the original design, and it works fairly easily here. It's at this point that we have something actually pretty one-to-one with the original old bird model, with the exception of the flamethrower, which I decided to try and give some more segmentation on its barrel to look a little bit more detailed, as well as giving it that little lighter thing that flamethrowers have on the end sometimes. It's here that I'm going to give you a little treat. Because it's at this point in my recording, I hadn't actually considered doing anything else here, and I fully went forward with the rest of the process using this blockout model. And I feel like its end result is different enough to what I eventually do with it that I can show you this. I was a bit unsatisfied, sure. It is a somewhat more realistic version, but it almost feels like the textures carried it in its entirety. Like those old Minecraft texture packs that claim to be photorealistic, but in reality it's like a stock image plastered over a mob like a cow or something. I wanted to do more, so I went back in, going all the way back to the modeling phase to give it another crack. So how can we give this thing its own identity? At first I went around thinking I could add more trims and insets, but it didn't take long to realize that was a cheap option. So I decided to go all in. Remember how I mentioned that some of the joints in the design weren't connected in a practical way? That's where I decided to properly start, beginning front and center with the old bird's head. In the original model, this thing is just wedged in there. I'm not even sure it can move, but it's got a built-in headlight and it makes sense that it should. And so, with a combination of cylinders, I created a pivoting joint with a vertical cylinder on the torso for sideways rotation, and another horizontal cylinder attached connecting to the head for looking up and down, all fitted into a crater in the torso. Is it perfect? I don't know, I'm not an engineer, but it feels more realistic than the previous iteration, and that's the mantra I'll continue utilizing. You probably don't remember this, but earlier I mentioned in passing that beveling can mess with some stuff. This is stuff. N-gons are polygons, consisting of 5 or more vertices, which are the corner points of faces that I mentioned earlier. These are usually considered not a good sign in your topology, and that's mainly in reference to animated characters, given the body will usually deform more organically, and N-gons can result in unnatural warping and glitching. In a scenario like this, the arm isn't going to be warping as much as the whole thing is going to be moving on a socket, so N-gons are actually pretty forgivable in this scenario. That being said, it's a good habit to fix these where you can, and that's what we're going to do here. We're also going to give the upper arm a bit of a trim and create a cavity to fit the torso sockets into. And now we can move on to the elbow joints. Cutting out holes to fit them into, I added a wheel joint that'd link the upper arm and forearms together. The idea following the original concept that the forearms largely follow a restricted axis, with them rotating from side to side. And while I could do the same for the upper arms, which originally seemed to only rotate forwards and backwards, I wanted to give the arms a little bit more mobility. So for now, I'll position them so that the character stands in an A pose rather than having their arms lowered at their sides, like an H pose or something. Which results in too much geometry clipping into itself, even on the original model. Looking back at our elbow connectors, which at this rate also somewhat double as the wrists, I noticed that the grabber and flamethrower that sat in them just didn't seem like they'd be very secure as is, and while you could say that the back ends are welded or even fed into the rest of the arm, I felt like it would look more interesting to add these metal bolt hinges for just a little bit more plausibility and to add a little bit more complexity to the shapes. We'll take a quick backtrack to give our upper arm sockets a new joint befitting of its new angle, with a hinge not entirely unlike what I did for the character's neck, with 2 cylinders connecting and rotating on different axes to allow both sideways and forwards rotation. With that quick bit out of the way though, it's time for something completely different. All these parts are meant to interlink and function as a full machine, and while it could be assumed that a lot of the mechanics are internally wired, I wanted to show a more immediately apparent source of power for this old bird. It should also be mentioned that the back of the old bird is fairly bare bones, just straight back all the way. And that's fine for the original design, but I just wanted to put some more visual draw to that area to complement its mostly front-facing design. My immediate thought is some kind of battery pack or like engine, but I know I needed to have 3 things. A vaguely believable energy source, a fuel source for the flamethrower separate to the barrel, and somewhere to wire the shoulder-mounted speakers into. So, that's where I started, going back to the speakers and revamping their design. The front of it's vague enough, considering it's essentially just a square with a sphere in it, but at the back end, I elected to make it more rounded, with a cylinder as its base shape rather than a cube. This will see more revision once we get it wired up, but for now we're going to take a quick detour into the grabber hand. If progress feels a bit back and forth, it's because I was still brainstorming ideas at this point and giving attention to whatever I thought was entertaining at that moment. That being said, I immediately knew starting this revision that I wanted to give the grabber hand much more bulk than its original design. This thing looks industrial, big, heavy, but its hand is like an arcade claw machine, which might possibly be the least threatening set of claws I've ever seen unless you're willing to sit there for 20 minutes while it tries to grab you. So, Operation Big Hands is a go. Make the base of the grabber wider and stockier and create new fingers with much more density. And for a touch of realism, we'll throw in some cylinder hinges with an inset at the front for the fingers to fit into so they have a defined axis to pivot from. Give the fingers some grip at its tip and that's that squared away. Another part of the model that I thought could use some attention to detail were the knee joints. Like the elbows, they just didn't connect realistically. Even in my original redesign, I tried to give this part of the model a slightly more realistic pivot by having the small half cylinder rotate around the top of the knee. But even then, the supports going up into the bottom of the thigh are just way too thin to support like this giant robot. So first things first, I decided to give the knee a cover for the joints to fit through and replace the existing one with a rotating gear. Is it a bit generic for a machine? Yeah, probably, but it's also a big classic looking robot, so I'll give myself a pass here. Another one attached to the thigh hole for good measure, and we've got something that doesn't work. At least not yet. The whole thing would just straight up roll and collapse over itself. We'll need something that might actually support the weight it's holding, so while we're thinking of a solution, we'll go back to those shoulder speakers from earlier. We're revising the shape, but keeping that cylinder base we made earlier, and adding a back-facing plug for the wires to fit into. These wires in question are made up of Bezier curves, which are effectively geometry that is... Hold on, is that how you pronounce that? Bezier curves. which are effectively geometry that is not edited using faces, but instead calculates a piece of geometry between two endpoints, and based on the way these endpoints are aligned or sized, changes the way the mesh in between these 2 points is curved. It's a good way to quickly make organically bending tubes without painstakingly trying to bend a cylinder in those positions, and we're just linking it onto a point on our placeholder power pack for now. And before we block out its full-on design, I wanted to start on the fuel tank for the pack. To make it, all we have to do is create a cylinder and bevel it at its ends for that pill shape. Create some loop cuts and extrude some support straps, and extrude a nozzle at the top for the flamethrower's tubing to fit into. I also duplicated this and stuck it at the underside of the flamethrower's barrel so it has its immediate source of fuel as well as a larger holding tank on its back. Using more Bezier curves, we can set up the tubing for this, and voila! A fueling system. Thing is, it's pretty clearly defined as a flamethrower now, and there's really no way to justify the fact that it shoots rockets, so I decided I just wanted a separate barrel for that function. And it's like a you load it in as you go. Stick in the rocket, go for it. Pulling references for a classic bazooka rocket launcher, I got to work with my cylinders to block out a close resemblance, and fitted it above the flamethrower in the socket. This meant adjusting some of the socket to fit with the bulkier design better, and I also took the chance to make sure the elbow wheel joint matched with its lower leg counterpart, and finally fell on the idea of just bolting some metal supports in there as a mean of supporting the weight. Is it perfect? Who knows, probably one of you does. But I decided this was a pretty sound strategy for supporting this kind of joint, and we'll see to it that the legs have these too. But for now, we're moving on to the bulk of our power pack. The idea for this concept was based on air raid sirens and the way those are designed, which would give this old bird a way of generating the large amount of sound required for its chest-mounted cannon, with the center of it having a battery pack akin to a large car battery and maybe an implied internal engine. As you can probably tell, this is built out of cylinders, and I made sure to connect it up with the fuel tank underneath, which quickly brain blasted me with the idea to put small fuel tanks inset into the sides of the thighs to act as the fuel source for the rocket thrusters that act as the robot's feet. Naturally, I adjusted these sockets as necessary to fit some tubing through, and connected said thrusters to their fuel source. While we're down here, we'll also give the thrusters that sort of striped ribbed look that rocket thrusters usually have. Putting attention back on our power pack though, I just picked out some places that seemed like it could benefit from detail tweaks, like adding some indentations here and there where it seemed right and giving the front of the head an inset rim so it looks like there's a separate faceplate, as well as going back to the grabber hand to implement a tube going down into the arm rather than having the whole thing fused to it, just so it has a little bit more freedom of movement. I also wanted to add some side covering to the upper arms just to give it a little bit more of a flare and square off the shoulders ever so slightly to complement the intimidation factor, since sharper shapes usually come off more villainous, while softer, rounder shapes are friendlier. It's now that I take the time to go to the midsection, where the pelvis and the torso connect. The original model already has a hinge in place for this design, and my only adjustment was to more visibly connect the lower and upper portions to the hinge itself and implement a cog-like wheel separating the two parts of the hinge just to make that separation clearer. Since the head is visibly separated from the rest of the body by its neck hinges, I decided to create a cylinder-based socket on the back of the head and feed it down into the power pack behind the battery, so it had a feasible way to receive power. Now we can go back to the legs, using our newfangled supports that we put on the arms to support the upper and lower parts of the legs, at least in a loosely conceptual manner. We'll also need to adjust the thigh to fit better around it, which actually benefits the shape language a bit, with the upwards contour guiding the eyes towards the main center of the design, which soon comes to a close. With a final once-over on the design, tweaking shapes and details as necessary, the blocking out phase is complete, and we have our model. We're almost out of the woods, but now we need to set this guy up for texture painting. Now you can't just throw this thing into a texture painting program and start brushing away, no. You see, when a model is being prepared for texture painting, the model must undergo a process known as UV mapping. I've talked about it before, and it's a tedious little task, possibly even the most tedious one, but here's how it works. In order to have an image be displayed over our model in the form of a texture, the model itself would need to exist in that image space with its faces being laid out within it. Think of it like a classic cube net. This would be a viable UV map for a cube. If you were to draw an image on that net and then refold those faces back into the shape of a cube, that drawing would be reflected on that 3D space. Translated onto a MECH, that gets a little harder. We need to mark out the seams along the edges of the faces of every object where the object would unravel out onto a UV map, and it's incredibly time consuming. But at least you get a time lapse. Once that process is complete, the model is, in theory, ready to be textured. However, there's one more thing I want to do here. And to do that, we need to talk about materials. When a model is given textures, those textures have to be assigned to a specific material. That way, a set of multiple objects can have the same material and be assigned a set of one or more textures within a specific shading setup, while another set of objects can have a different material and thus be assigned a different set of textures. Our newfangled old bird in question will have two different materials, a primary set that affects the main body areas and larger objects, while a secondary set is responsible for the textures in some of the smaller or otherwise further removed parts of the model. The reasoning for this is that while it'd be easier and even more performance friendly to have the whole character use the same texture set, the amount of coverage required for the whole character would mean that those textures wouldn't actually be able to pack as much detail without unnecessarily large image files, which would just tank the performance, unless you wanted to settle for lesser quality. So we go with two materials, with their own respective texture sets for this. Within these texture sets, we have a series of images, used for specific shading purposes. Luckily, I have the scrapped remake of the old bird I made earlier, which should serve nicely for demonstration. You see, we're using something called a PBR, or physically based rendering setup. What that means is, rather than an NPR, or non-photorealistic rendering setup, the shading setup for PBR uses more than just a color image to achieve its look. But going forward, you should know that the flat color texture intended to give a model its base colors is known as an albedo, or on some occasions a diffuse, although diffuse is technically the flat color with some basic shading. Albedo is the pure color, and it's the base of a PBR rendering setup. The other key parts of a PBR setup, and the part that makes it a PBR setup, are the other textures that affect the specific ways a material's shading is displayed. The textures we'll be using in this category are the metallic texture, which dictates which parts of a model are rendered as metallic and which are rendered as non-metallic. The roughness texture, which dictates the shininess of a model, with black being entirely glossy and white being entirely matte. And lastly, the normal maps. These are quite colourful images, with each colour denoting a specific direction. The engine will look at these colours within the texture and render the lighting in correlation with the colours on the normal map and what direction they represent, resulting in something of an optical illusion where, despite being a simpler surface, the lighting is altered by the normal map to give off the appearance that there's more detail there. This is a key part of texture optimization in modern game engines, and lets us get away with more than a lower-end machine could typically handle. Acquiring these textures is a different story. To do so, we need to let our texturing program know what goes where. And to do that, we need to give each object a name. Doesn't matter what it is, as long as we know what's what, because we're doing it twice. You see, I've also created a duplicate of our old bird model that contains various subdivisions and bevel modifiers, ultimately serving as the anti-optimized version in favor of subtle smoothing and clean edges, and just an overall look of higher detail. This version's object names have the suffix _high. This is to mark these as the high polygon version, while our original version will be marked with the suffix _low, since it's the low polygon version. Using this, we can begin an operation known as texture baking within our texturing program, which in this case is Substance Painter. That texture baking will take the _low model and bake the _high model over it, creating the PBR textures we went through earlier, which can be applied to the lower poly model while giving the illusion of the detail on the high poly one. Simple stuff, I know, but now it's time to well and truly get into the thick of it and start texturing. While there's a lot of work to get done here, first and foremost we'll use a base material. Materials in Substance Painter are a bit different to the ones I mentioned earlier. In the context of our model, we can paint onto either the primary or secondary material slots we established earlier. But the materials within Substance Painter are more like their own texture setups, with the aforementioned albedos, metallic or roughness and normal maps and whatnot built into them, which can be painted onto our model and thus influence the actual textures on our model. In this case, most of the old bird is treadplate metal as far as I can tell from the original, and while I could create my own layer setup to achieve this look, Substance Painter has its own metal material that works well to get that initial base down. Bonus feature is that this is a smart material, which is slightly different from a normal substance painter material in that the layers it comes with are built to be affected by some of the textures we baked earlier, including a few I didn't mention that won't come out of the export with us, and these work within Substance Painter itself to create wear, dirt, and rust in places where it deems it appropriate. With the metal material in place, we can mask out areas where it isn't warranted, like the speakers, headlamp, tubing, so on and so forth, and with that base in place, we can start getting to work. Since I'd basically already done this before, I knew exactly what I wanted to start with. Looking on the original design, the speakers are covered in a mesh, and we can use the base metallic layer and overlay it with another layer that has a raised height to it. Real quick, Substance Painter also has a height texture that's represented as black at its lowest and white at its highest, but it only exists here, and on export it'll be reflected in the normal map textures instead. But we can place one of these included procedural textures as a mask on our elevated layer. In this case, a tile texture rotated 45 degrees to achieve the appearance of the mesh that'd typically cover a speaker system. Obviously it's a little bland like this, so we'll have to go ahead and use some other procedural mask textures to layer in some dirt around the edges and trailing down from the top. In a similar vein, we can also use a procedural mask with a lowered elevation on the barrel of the flamethrower to emulate the vent, grill, the holes where stuff comes out. And that's just the texture with a bunch of spots on it. Some orange for the fuel tank, plus a bit of matte on its roughness layer so it's not as shiny, and we'll also use a slightly darkened layer over the whole model in some areas where it can break up the colours a little and just give it a little bit of contrast. The lens of the headlamp is a greenish yellow colour and fairly shiny, with a darker, less shiny dirt layer around its edges. However, rather than using a procedural texture or painting in the wear, I'm going to use something called a smart mask. Different to the smart materials, a smart mask is also influenced by the textures baked from our higher poly model. But rather than a whole set of layers driven by smart masks to achieve a specific appearance, it's just the mask itself. In a way, a smart material is just a bunch of layers with smart masks slapped together, but I digress. Despite being tread metal, the metal on our model is just pretty standard metal. So it's time to use a procedural texture on a slightly lighter elevated layer to bring that out. And while the metal plates that make up this robot could in theory be connected quite seamlessly, the old bird strikes me more as something cobbled together in an industrial setting. So we can also use Substance Painter's tools, which are effectively types of brushes with their own built-in texture sets and masks for specific purposes, like bullet holes, screw heads, zippers, or in this case, welding seams. And that's what we're gonna do. Go over every edge on the metal where there would reasonably be welding done, so we can have our model just have a little smidge more believability in its assembly. Speaking of those tools, I did actually end up using the screw bolt tool to place some screws around the model, particularly around the back battery, just to give it a bit more detail. I also went over this area with something called a hard surface stamp, which is really a normal map-based texture, meaning it exclusively affects the height detail on the surface. I also went ahead and pulled a barcode texture from Lethal Company's files and imported it as an alpha stamp. An alpha in this context basically being a mask, but specifically for brushes rather than layers. And I just stamped it right there on the fuel tank. I also stamped a little orange insignia on the shoulders of the old bird, which I think plays a bit into its military backstory, which, if you'll look closely, is actually just a squared version of the little label that appears on the worker's jumpsuit. Did the Lethal Company make a giant murder robot? I don't know, but they certainly sound like they would. Onto the tubing! The initial layer is dark, with an even darker, heightened layer overlaid with a mask texture that makes it look something like those cable covers you see for protecting and managing wires. Since we're looking in that area anyway, we'll also go ahead and do another go-over with some hard surface stamps for that little added detail and zooming out to look over the whole model. The only thing left to do was add a gradient dirt mask to our old bird with an increasing intensity closer to the feet, considering if this thing's been dropping to the ground from orbit, walking around a bunch and taking short distance flights on its feet rockets, there's probably going to be more grime the lower you go. But nonetheless, we can take a good look at our mech and know we've finished the bulk of our work. But there's one last phase to our process. Rigging! The process of taking a skeleton and assigning it to a model. Now, when I say skeleton, I don't mean your calcium-clad xylophone-type skeletons, but the type of skeletons you find in 3D engines. They look something like this. This is the skeleton I made for the original remake I did, and you can see that it's meant to line up with the model itself. Thankfully, because I already did this here, there isn't much extra work in building the skeleton, but I will have to do some assigning. Keep your ears open, because this is how it works. Assuming you don't have anything automated here, you'll be lining up your skeleton with your model and assigning the model to the skeleton. This means that your model is now essentially contained within the skeleton in the context of the 3D hierarchy. You move the skeleton, your model goes with it. The model should also now have something called vertex groups. These correlate to every bone on your skeleton, and you can assign these vertex bone groups to the faces of your model. With more organic characters, this would be done via a process known as weight painting or skinning, which involves assigning these vertex groups to your model by actually painting on the model with varying intensity. Blue is not affected at all, while red means that it is fully affected. In this case, we won't need to blend much of our vertex groups outside of some exceptions like the tubes connecting some parts of the model, but for the most part we're flat assigning parts of the model to the bone groups. Considering it's a mech, and all of its moving parts are more or less solid pieces, it's pretty convenient and makes the process much easier for us here. After all that effort, we're able to reveal the final product in all of its glory. Behold, the old bird, redesigned. This one took longer to cook, in no small part due to my hard drive going kaput, but we finally got there, and I'm pretty happy with the outcome. If you watched the whole way through, thank you, it really helps. If you did just skip to the end to check it out, yeah, that sounds about right. I don't blame you, we got places to be. But if you do think what you saw here was pretty banging, it'd be cool if you I don't know, liked and subscribed or something. As always, there's a link below to download the model. I've actually been pleasantly surprised by what I've seen My Lethal Company models be used for. So I'll say it again, if you do want to use any of this stuff, go for it. I will not stop you. Do as you please with them, because I sure ain't gonna use them again. And if you guys have anything in particular you want to see done, just throw out a comment, because I do see them, especially when there's a bunch of the same one, and hopefully the next one can come out in a more timely manner. As a final bonus, this video was originally meant to be the Ultra Kill video before my hard drive's untimely demise. Specifically, it was V1, so here's a screenshot of an autosave blender kept of one of the demonstrations I had, as well as this GIF of an animation I was working on for its intro. Tragically, I don't actually have any record of the remade model, which was completed, textures and all, even rigged. But at least I probably learned something, like backing up my drives. Plus the game was super good, so at least I, got to play that. Either way, that's all I had for this one. Thanks again, everyone.